The good and bad of the Australian Labor Party.
So I've spent a lot of time talking about the coalition, but what about the Labor Party? In terms of their story arc, they've been in opposition since 2013. They spent this time well, they've put their leadership troubles behind them, and they've united behind their leader, Bill Shorten. They've developed a policy platform that is distinct from the coalition's, and their likely election will definitely mean a more progressive direction for Australia. But my problem with Labor has always been they don't have the vision or the commitment to deal with the major structural issues in society, such as inequality, degradation of the environment, unemployment, weeding out corruption at a federal level,
and so on and so on.
But what I've decided to do is to highlight two policies which demonstrate the good and the bad of Labor. So firstly, the good.
Labor's franking credit policy.
Now this policy is a bit technical, but essentially we have a situation at the moment where predominantly wealthy retirees who have significant savings in their superannuation, they can be withdrawing some of this money each year for an income, let's say $50,000. And all of this money, understandably, is tax-free. They can also have a significant share portfolio and be getting paid share dividends worth, let's say, $50,000 each year. And so they've got a $100,000 income and they're not paying any tax. And because of the policy as it exists at the moment, they can also get a tax credit worth, say, $6,000 from the government, even though they're paying no tax. Labor's policy is to get rid of this $6,000 subsidy. So this is a good policy. There's a term in economics called rent seeking, which is essentially unearned wealth that accrues to an individual or a corporation due to a special privilege granted to them by government. And that can be in the form of a direct subsidy, a tax break, or a tariff as examples. And the policy as it currently stands is an example of rent seeking. So rent seeking's bad, we need less of it. This is a good policy by Labor. We shouldn't be giving billions of dollars to predominantly wealthy people.
Part of the promise that we all keep as Australians is that we make a contribution and don't seek to take one. And when all Australians do that, that's when we get the fair go mentality.
This money should instead be being spent on public goods and universal services such as ecosystem restoration, universal childcare, education, you name it. And I highlighted this issue because it's already featured heavily in the media and in political campaigning. The coalition are running a scare campaign on this policy. They're calling it a retiree tax.
Vote Labor and a retiree tax is on the horizon.
The government continues to go on the attack on the policy, including in this week's debate.
Because it does hit pensioners. As he knows full well, you'll have a Labor government that is going to steal the money from thousands of retirees.
Which is complete bulldust because it's the removal of a subsidy, it's not the addition of a tax, and it doesn't impact all retirees. So hopefully Labor stick to their guns on this policy.
Labor's plan to address housing affordability.
And then we come to the bad. So for some context, a report came out a few years ago which showed that Australia's two largest cities, Sydney and Melbourne, they're both ranked in the top 5 for most unaffordable housing markets in the whole world. And these two cities, they're home to 9.9 million people. They're hubs for jobs, for services, infrastructure, entertainment. And Essentially, Labor's plan to address housing affordability is to give $6.6 billion to property investors to provide housing that is 20% below the market rate. Now, this policy is of course better than nothing, but it does nothing to address the root cause of housing unaffordability. Housing is so unaffordable, particularly in these two large cities, because it has been turned into a commodity rather than a basic human right.
Australia's recent property boom was overwhelmingly led by Sydney and Melbourne. Over the past decade, Sydney real estate surged ahead of every other capital city apart from Melbourne.
And because it is a commodity, what has happened is that huge amounts of capital have flowed into property investment. Those with the most capital have bought up as much land as they can in the cities. Because land is a diminishing resource, as population grows and people need a place to live, the supply of land obviously shrinks, and the hoarding of land by people and corporations with the most capital. This has also been exacerbated by coalition and Labor governments who have put in place or kept in place generous tax breaks around capital gains tax and negative gearing. And the combination of these factors and some others as well has pushed housing prices up so high that for my generation, people are either locked out of the housing market completely, or an affordable home that is in proximity to the jobs, the services, the infrastructure, and that is livable enough that you can raise a family there if you want to. That's simply out of reach, and until we decommodify housing and make it a human right for Australian citizens, this problem isn't going to be solved.
Like many migrant families, Australia's property obsession was embraced by the Guptas when they moved to Melbourne from Dubai in 1990. The Guptas now own more than 30 properties between them.
Yes, I might have a few properties, Dad might have a few properties, you know, Mum's got a few properties, even Grandma's got a couple up her sleeve, right? You shortchanged me. For us, it's a never-ending thing, buying as much of the monopoly board as one sees fit.
So my criticism of this policy is it does nothing to decommodify housing and is in essence a transfer of $6.6 billion of public money to the property industry. And so this policy, it'll benefit some people, but the main benefactors will be the property industry, the bank CEOs and their ridiculous bonuses. And at the end of the day, we'll still have a system where some people have the right to own 30 properties and other people have the right to own 0.
The 2019 federal election campaign.
So in terms of how the campaign is going to play out, we're already seeing what's happening. The coalition are running on being better economic managers
and skilling up Australians through our apprenticeships program. All of this while keeping Australians safe and keeping Australians' borders secure. Now, all of that is achieved because of a strong economy, and I'd say that not all governments do manage the economy well, and not all governments do manage budgets well. That's why managing the economy well and managing your finances well is so critical to everything else.
They're running a big scare campaign saying that Labor is going to be a big tax government.
There's a theme here. It seems that the solution to every problem that the Labor Party sees is more taxation. What we're talking about here is $387 billion worth of new taxes over the next 10 years. So Labor's approach is, when they've run out of their money, the government's money, they're coming after your money. That is Labor's fundamental plan for being in government. $387 billion in new taxes.
Even though essentially all Labor's platform is offering is removing tax breaks rather than adding new taxes. And we've also seen that the coalition allocated significant money in the budget for tax cuts, and I really wish people would realise that tax cuts are not good economic policy. If you're a working class person, and once again I mean that in the broad sense of the word, and you live in a country that has a progressive taxation system, you're always better off that tax money being spent on universal services, education, childcare, public transport, rather than giving tax cuts, because the overwhelming benefits of those accrue to those who have significant wealth in society. And one other interesting dynamic will be whether the coalition tries to run a scare campaign on border policy and say that Labor's going to reopen the borders, because Labor are effectively in lockstep with them when it comes to that area.
And we know that Bill Shorten has a track record, as Labor does, of not being able to manage borders, just like they can't manage money.
And so with the campaign, we're always going to see some gaffes from some politicians.
No due diligence in Sydney either, where the Prime Minister greeted a woman during a street walk.
And there's always going to be some issues that pop up out of the blue and get a spotlight shone on them.
This story begins in outback Queensland, on some of our most iconic farmland, and leads all the way to the Cayman Islands. There's a trail of money, big money, moving across the globe, from the sale of valuable water licences, through complex debt structures and opaque ownership patterns. And the questions raised lead us to two prominent men, Barnaby Joyce and Angus Taylor. Taylor became the Energy Minister when Malcolm Turnbull was dumped as PM. He's an Oxford-educated Rhodes Scholar with big wealth, big business connections, and tipped for even bigger things in politics. He was a partner with management firm McKinsey. He's also specialised in agricultural investments, and it's that part of his CV which is now raising questions. At the centre of this are water buybacks.
But I think at this stage, the mood of many people is that they're looking for a change in government, and so I don't think the campaign will matter as much if it was a much closer election. So I'm predicting Labor to have at least a 10-seat majority in the House of Representatives, but what will be most fascinating will be to see the Senate results. Labor and the coalition will likely have a pretty equal number of senators, and then the question will be, what does the remaining Senate look like, and how many positions are held by the Greens and Independents and parties like One Nation, and what will that mix look like, and how will Labor negotiate with these senators to get their platform implemented. And there's already been some tensions developing between Labor and the Greens about climate change and energy policy.
You mentioned Labor. In a speech last week, you said you'd like to negotiate closely with Labor if they win this election around climate change. Bill Shorten pretty immediately ruled out a close working relationship with the Greens. What will you say to change Bill Shorten's mind if he's elected?
Well, he needs to respect the wishes of 1.5 million people who voted for the Greens last time. Millions of people vote for the Greens because they support strong action on climate change. And this election is about action on climate change. Now, Bill Shorten is taking a weaker policy in 2019 to the policy he took in 2016, which is weaker again than 2013. Our job is to ensure that through our numbers in the Senate, we drive action towards ensuring we transition our economy away from coal to renewables. Well, what I'll say to Bill Shorten is do what Julia Gillard did, negotiate constructively, collaboratively, let's work together and let's actually get some good outcomes for the climate, not for your big coal donors, but for the community who are desperate for action on climate change.
So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out.
The state of Australian politics.
Now, a Labor government is absolutely going to mean a different direction for Australia.
The choice for you, the choice for our country is clear. It can be more of the same or a change for the better. Division and drift or unity and purpose. More cuts to health and education or better schools and hospitals, rising cost of living and stagnant wages, or a better deal for working families.
But I think when I zoom out and look at the state of Australian politics, what's very stark is the lack of a broad, true left-wing movement in this country. So in any capitalist system, the fundamental factor that will determine what type of life you lead in that system is your class. So there's always going to be a fundamental divide between the working class, that is, working people who are forced to sell their labour for a wage, and the ruling class, and those are the people who have significant ownership of the means of production. And these people can be billionaire mining magnates, they can be people with significant share and property portfolios, they can be CEOs of banks earning 50 times the average wage and getting ridiculous bonuses as well. And they can be partners of big consulting companies. And the truth of this divide can be seen in Australia, that when you look at how our economy has been growing over the last couple of decades, the vast amount of that wealth has been accruing at the top of society. And this can be seen with whatever metric you want to use for wealth inequality. And that can be the proportion of wealth that's accruing to the top 10%, the top 5%, or the top 1%. And so for all of those in the working class, and that's most people, even though the pie's been growing, you're not really seeing much of a larger slice, and life is definitely not as good as it could be. And then you look at the political parties' response to this issue, and you have the coalition, whose core ideology neoliberalism, which actually further concentrates wealth with the ruling class in society. And then you have the Labor Party, who were obviously born out of the Labor movement, but for a long time they've been deeply compromised by taking tens of millions of dollars of corporate donations, and so that's kind of hollowed out the party, and now they're happy to fight for continued investment in healthcare and education, and they're happy to kind of secure a slice of the pie for unions that are associated with Labor. But any talk of real major structural reforms or taxation, and they run for the hills. And then you have the Greens, who are pushing for a social democracy model, which is greater wealth distribution through taxation, greater investment in public services, and obviously they want to take better care of the environment. And this platform, if implemented, would absolutely benefit the lives of working class people. But many people on the left seem to be stuck obsessing over the clash of identities and which groups of people appear to be most marginalised, and there's a hyper focus on race and gender discourse. And so broadly overall, there's really a lack of class consciousness in Australia. However, I do think there are some class divides starting to show up in terms of voting patterns. So when you look at voter surveys, you see there is a clear generational divide. That is that younger voters are more likely to vote for left-wing parties like the Greens, and older voters are more likely to vote for conservative parties like the Coalition. And when you look at why that is, you know that housing affordability is an issue that registers very strongly with younger voters. And when you think about the difference in policy between the Coalition and the Greens have been strong advocates of decommodifying housing, and the Coalition have obviously implemented policies that have commodified housing and made it easier for wealthy individuals to accrue properties at the expense of other people. And so effectively, because younger voters have been locked out of affordable housing, and access to housing is a class issue rather than an identity issue, there is a clear class divide forming there. And it's going to be interesting to see whether issues like that provide the grounds for a broad left-wing class-based movement.
The party that I'm voting for in the Australian 2019 federal election.
In this election, I'll be voting for the Greens. They've got a strong record of grassroots political organising, particularly around protecting the environment. They don't take money from corporations or big business, and they've been outspoken advocates of getting money out of politics, as well as establishing a federal anti-corruption commission, and they're pushing for a more democratic system overall.
Greens MPs working together with the community have forced the two old parties to face up to the issues that they would rather avoid. We've kept climate change at the heart of the national debate, a debate where the ongoing failure of leadership and governance has resulted in the Liberal Party dumping their leader rather than taking the action that's required. It was the Greens who led the charge on a Royal Commission to lift the lid on the fraud and corruption in the banking and finance sector, while the two major parties voted against it. It was my predecessors, Bob Brown and Christine Milne, who flew the flag for a decade as lone voices for marriage equality. And finally, in this parliament, it became law. In one of my first meetings with Malcolm Turnbull, he told me he would not support our long-standing call for a national anti-corruption watchdog. Well, guess what? Now a national anti-corruption watchdog has cross-party support, and it will soon become law. My colleague Senator Steele-John, who was never going to give up until justice was served, helped secure a Royal Commission into violence, abuse and neglect of people with disability. A levy on the banks, access to medicinal cannabis, advancing the drug law reform debate, fixing the backpacker tax while getting $100 million for land care. A breakthrough for more compassionate treatment of refugees. We've held the line on bad legislation, and we've held a rotten government to account. We've protected laws that prevent racial discrimination. We've blocked cuts to health and education, and we've stopped big business getting massive tax cuts in the name of trickle-down economics. The list of Greens' achievements in this parliament is a long one.
As I've mentioned previously, they're pushing for the social democracy model, and what I like most about this platform is the greater investment in public services and the huge material benefits this platform would provide to the Australian community. So some of the things their platform includes is greater investment in healthcare and education, increasing New Start and youth allowance, addressing housing affordability by removing tax breaks for negative gearing and capital gains tax, as well as using that money to invest in public housing that anyone can apply for, having a transition to 100% renewable energy by 2030, and having government funded training for workers so that it's a just transition. And they're also pushing for nationalising the energy grid, because privatisation of energy has been a huge problem in Australia. And how are they planning to pay for all these policies?
I mean, we can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. Come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
Tax is one of the most powerful tools we have to curb excesses in wealth and to reduce poverty. It's a tool to pull risk and provide essential public services that the market alone will not provide. It's a tool to drive down pollution. Tax builds our communities. It paves our roads, it shelters our homeless, it teaches our children, it feeds our pensioners. Tax is how we build a decent society. Tax handouts, tax cuts, tax loopholes, they don't build a thing.
So the Greens' taxation policies include ending government subsidies to corporations so that they get cheap fuel, ending government subsidies for private health insurance, not engaging in the race to the bottom when it comes to tax cuts and actually keeping that tax revenue to spend on services, as well as not spending government money to export arms to Saudi Arabia. As well as this, they also want to put a tax on pollution. They want to put a tax on the super profits that are being generated from the fossil fuel and mining industries. And they also want to make sure some big corporations actually pay tax in the first place by closing tax loopholes. And so that's how they're going to pay for, this greater investment in public services.
Interesting seats to follow on election night.
So I've picked a few interesting seats to follow, and I'm going to give my predictions for these. So the first is the contest for the seat of Dickson, and this seat is currently held by a Liberal member and the current Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton. And Peter Dutton is about as far right as you can get within the coalition, and he's got a history of demonising asylum seekers and bashing up on minorities a bit. And his campaign started really awfully, where he made a criticism of his Labor challenger, which is Ali France, and his criticism related to her disability, and he was fairly rightly criticised for that.
Labor's candidate for Dickson, Ali France, her rival, Peter Dutton, yesterday suggesting she was using her disability as an excuse for not moving to the electorate.
No, I think those comments have been taken out of context.
Today, Peter Dutton tweeted an apology to Ms France for those comments.
But the progressive political organisation GetUp is having a campaign to unseat Peter Dutton.
He's the main Queensland target of activist group GetUp.
It's not personal, it's really about what he stands for, it's about that hard right ideology.
And he only holds his seat by a fairly small margin, less than 2.5%, and some are predicting the swing to Labor in this election will be about 3%, so on those numbers, Peter Dutton could well and truly lose his seat. So maybe it's the pessimist in me, but I actually see Peter Dutton holding his seat. And it's because that Queensland is much more conservative leaning than other states in Australia like Victoria. There's a section of the community that really does like Peter Dutton's politics, and he's got a very high profile now, so it'll be an interesting seat to watch, but I think Peter Dutton will retain his seat.
A former police officer, Mr Dutton, was first elected 18 years ago. He survived a 5% swing against him at the last election and now holds on by just 1.7%.
He certainly is a polarising figure. He has his great devotees in the seat of Dickson. He's got people who absolutely loathe him.
The second is the contest for the seat of Wills, which is my electorate. And that contest is between the current Labor member, Peter Khalil.
Mr Speaker, I stand in this place because I was elected by the people of Wills to serve them and to make a difference to their lives.
And his main challenger is the Greens candidate, Adam Pulford.
I'm Adam Pulford. I'm 29, a proud queer person, and the Greens candidate for Wills for the coming federal election.
The Wills electorate is a very left-leaning part of the country. Peter Khalil might be well known to some, but he doesn't have a significant profile because he's a backbencher. Adam Pulford, he's young, passionate, articulate, and from all reports he's running a very good campaign.
Australia's getting richer, it's one of the richest countries in the world, but that wealth is ending up in the hands of a wealthy few, leaving the rest of us behind.
And the Greens platform is of course much more left-leaning than Labor, who are very much in the centre. So it'll be a very interesting contest. It's going to take a very big swing to unseat Peter Khalil, something like 5 to 6%. I think Adam will run a really great campaign, but I think he might come up just a little bit short, but this will be a very interesting seat to watch. The last seat I'll touch on will be the contest for the seat of Indi. This is a rural electorate that's currently held by the independent member Cathy McGowan. From all reports, Cathy McGowan has done a fantastic job advocating on behalf of her constituents.
And the Minister noted, "I'm amazed to see the depth of commitment from local communities, but I'm not amazed. This is true rural Australia." And it is this commitment which has resulted in the report called Towards a Totally Renewable Indi, and it's a case study in community energy. It shows how communities across Indi are working together to create a clean energy future, and there's opportunities for everybody.
But she's stepping down and she's being replaced by another independent candidate, that is Helen Haynes.
Cathy McGowan has now retired, and Voices for Indi has anointed nurse and midwife Helen Haynes as her potential successor.
This seat was previously a Liberal held seat, and I think them, as well as the Nationals, are going to throw a lot of resources at it. It's going to be interesting because it's looking like that the Coalition are going to do very badly in Victoria, but I actually think that either, most likely the Liberals, but perhaps even the Nationals as well, will actually win this seat back. But it'll be an interesting one to watch.
If Helen Haynes wins, it would be the first time an independent has succeeded another. A win for Helen Haynes would show that there's still a pathway to Parliament for independents, no matter how difficult. But a loss would prove that the shock upset for the Liberals here several years ago was more of an anomaly than the norm.
Thanks everybody for watching, and stay tuned for future content as I've got many new and exciting videos in production. Thanks again.